My son-in-law threw my blazer in the trash, not by accident. He picked it up off the back of the chair where I had hung it, walked it to the kitchen, and dropped it into the garbage can under the sink. Then he came back to the table and said, with a smile that was meant to look like a joke, that we needed to look presentable tonight because this dinner was important for the family image. I was sitting right there. I watched him do it. My daughter watched him do it. She laughed the way people laugh when they are embarrassed but do not know how to stop something in motion. He had been doing things like that for 2 years. Small things. Things designed to remind me that I was tolerated in that house, not welcomed. That my presence was something to be managed, not valued. What he did not know, and what I had never mentioned, was that I owned the building his restaurant was in. Every square foot of it. I had owned it for 11 years. I had never said a word about it because it had never been relevant. That night, it became relevant. Before I tell you what happened next, I want you to think about something, because this story is not really about a blazer. It is about what happens when someone decides, slowly and deliberately, that you do not deserve basic respect in your own family. And I want to ask you something honestly. How long would you have stayed quiet? Because I stayed quiet for 2 years. 2 years of small moments exactly like this one. And I want you to decide, right now, whether I waited too long or whether I waited exactly long enough. Stay with me. Because the answer to that question is the whole point of this story. My name is Stella. I am 63 years old. I have a daughter named Vivian who is 34, who works in pharmaceutical sales management, and who, as of the night this story takes place, had just been promoted to regional director. I have 2 grandchildren I see on alternating weekends. I have a small property portfolio that I built over 30 years, starting with one duplex I bought with my late husband Frank when we were both 28 years old and had almost nothing. Frank passed 9 years ago. Since then, I have managed everything myself. I am telling you these things in this order because the order matters. Vivian married a man named Todd 3 years before this story begins. Todd is 36. He owns a restaurant called Harmon's, a mid-size place in the commercial district that does well enough on weekends and struggles through the week. He is handsome in a very deliberate way, the kind of handsome that requires regular maintenance and a specific wardrobe. He has strong opinions about appearances, about how things look, about who fits the image of a thing and who does not. When Vivian brought Todd home the first time, I liked him. I will say that clearly because I do not want you to think I was looking for reasons to distrust him from the beginning. I was not. I am 63 years old and I have learned, through a great deal of living, that first impressions are data points, not verdicts. I thought he was charming. A little too polished, maybe. A little too aware of how he was landing in the room, but charming. The discomfort started small, the way it always does with people who are fundamentally dismissive. It is never one large event at the beginning. It is a pattern of small events that you keep finding charitable interpretations for until the interpretations run out. The first small event was at a family birthday dinner about 8 months after the wedding. I had arrived in a dress I liked, a deep green wrap dress that I had owned for years and always felt good in. Todd looked at me when I walked in and said, with that particular half-smile of his, that green was a difficult color to pull off. He said it the way people say things when they want the cruelty to have a polite surface. Vivian laughed nervously. I said I had always liked green and moved on. The second small event was at Christmas. I had brought a dish, a baked pasta that I have been making since Vivian was a child and that she has always requested at family gatherings. Todd tasted it, set his fork down, and said to the table generally that he preferred his pasta with a lighter hand on the cheese. He said it like a review. Like I was staff. Vivian changed the subject. I ate my pasta, I said nothing. The third small event was when Todd told Vivian in front of me that her mother's house needed updating, that it had a dated quality that reflected a certain generation's limitations with design. He did not look at me when he said it. He was looking at Vivian. That is a specific technique, talking about someone in front of them as if they are furniture. I noted it. I kept noting. I kept filing. I kept giving him the benefit of a doubt that he was not earning and did not deserve. The reason I stayed quiet through all of it was Vivian. Not because I was weak. Not because I did not have words for what was happening. I stayed quiet because Vivian was happy, or was working very hard to appear happy, and I had made a decision when she married him that I would not be the source of conflict in her marriage unless the conflict was unavoidable. I had watched too many mothers-in-law make that mistake. I had no intention of becoming a reason for my daughter to choose. But I want to be honest with you. Staying quiet has a cost. Every time you absorb something without responding, you are making a deposit into an account. And accounts compound. The night of the blazer was the night the account came due. Vivian's promotion to regional director was a significant thing. She had worked toward it for 3 years. She managed a team of 14 people. The promotion came with a salary increase, a new title, and a dinner that her company hosted at a private dining room in a downtown hotel. Family was invited. Todd had organized a pre-dinner gathering at his restaurant first, a small toast among family before the official event. I had been looking forward to it for weeks. I arrived at Harmon's at 6:15, wearing dark slacks, a silk blouse, and a blazer I had owned for 12 years. The blazer is a charcoal gray Italian wool blend that I bought during a trip to Milan with Frank the year before he got sick. It is the best piece of clothing I own. I wore it to Frank's funeral. I have worn it to every important occasion since. It is not flashy. It is simply excellent in the way that excellent things are, quietly, undeniably. I hung it on the back of my chair when I sat down because the restaurant was warm. Todd came out of the kitchen about 10 minutes after I arrived. He greeted everyone. He kissed Vivian. He looked around the table. His eyes landed on my blazer hanging on the chair, and something moved across his face. Not disgust exactly. The specific expression of a man who has decided that a thing is out of place and that correcting it is within his authority. He picked it up. He did not ask. He did not say, "Excuse me, is this yours?" He picked it up off the back of my chair, walked toward the kitchen, and I watched him from my seat drop it into the garbage can under the prep counter before he pushed through the kitchen door again. He came back to the table. He straightened his jacket. He said with a smile that they needed to look sharp tonight because this dinner was important. He said the restaurant had an image and the pre-dinner photos would end up on the company's social media. I said calmly, "Todd, you just put my blazer in the trash." He said he had moved it. He said it was a slip of the hand, said it quickly, without quite meeting my eyes. I said, I watched you drop it in the kitchen garbage can. He said, Stella, tonight is about Vivian, let's not make it about you. And there it was. The technique perfected over 3 years of small events. Whatever the thing is that he has done, the problem becomes my response to it. My noticing it. My saying anything about it at all. Vivian said, Mom, do you want me to get it? I said no, I said it quietly. I stood up, went to the kitchen, retrieved my blazer from the garbage can, shook it out, put it back on, and returned to the table. I did not say another word about it for the rest of that evening. But something had shifted in me. Not a decision exactly. More like a door that had been standing slightly ajar for 2 years finally swinging all the way open. I looked at Todd across the table, laughing with Vivian's colleagues, holding court, performing the image he had decided he wanted to project. And I thought about the building. Let me tell you about the building. Frank and I bought our first property, that duplex, when we were 28. Over the following 3 decades, we built carefully. Never flashy, never leveraged beyond what we could sustain. When Frank passed, I inherited everything and continued managing it. I sold 2 properties that no longer fit the portfolio. I bought 3 others. One of those properties was a mixed-use commercial building in the downtown district, 3 floors, retail and restaurant space on the ground floor, office space above. I had purchased it 11 years ago when the neighborhood was transitioning, and the price reflected that transition. The neighborhood had finished transitioning about 6 years later. By then, the building was worth considerably more than I had paid for it. Harmon's, Todd's restaurant, occupied the ground floor corner unit of that building. Todd had signed a commercial lease there 4 years ago, before he and Vivian were married. At the time, the lease had been managed by a property management company I used for day-to-day operations. Todd had never met me in a professional context. He had no reason to connect his landlord, a holding company registered under a name that did not include my surname, to the woman who showed up at family dinners in a green wrap dress and a charcoal blazer. I had never told him. Tea had not seemed relevant. It had not seemed like something I needed to use. I want to be precise about what I decided that night. I did not decide to destroy Todd. I am not a person who operates from destruction. I decided to stop protecting him from the truth of his situation. There is a difference between those 2 things that matters enormously. That night, after the company dinner, after I had watched Vivian receive her award and give a speech that made me cry, after I had driven home alone and sat in my kitchen for an hour thinking, I called my attorney. My attorney is a man named Gerald Whitmore who has handled my property affairs for 19 years. I called him at 10:45 at night, which I had never done before, and he picked up on the 3rd ring because Gerald is, above all things, a professional. I told him I wanted a full review of Todd's lease. I told him I wanted to know the exact terms, the renewal timeline, and any clauses related to property owner discretion on renewal. I told him I also wanted to know whether there had been any lease violations in the current term. Gerald said he would have everything to me by the following morning. I went to bed. I slept better than I had in 2 years. Gerald's report arrived by email at 8:17 the next morning. I read it over coffee with the particular focus of a woman who has been managing property contracts for 30 years and knows exactly what she is looking at. The lease had 18 months remaining before renewal. There was a standard clause giving the property owner the right to decline renewal with 90 days written notice, for any reason, as long as notice was provided within the window specified in the contract. There were also two items in the violation review that Gerald had flagged. The first was a signage issue. Todd had installed exterior signage that exceeded the dimensions specified in his lease agreement. It was not a dramatic violation, but it was documented and uncorrected, which meant it had been outstanding for over a year. The second was more significant. Todd had been subletting a portion of his kitchen space on weekend mornings to a private catering operation. This was a direct violation of his lease, which prohibited subletting of any portion of the premises without written consent of the property owner. Gerald noted that this had been flagged by the property management company 8 months ago and that a letter had been sent to Todd's business address requesting clarification. No response had ever been received. I sat with my coffee and I read that twice. Todd had been violating his lease for over a year. He had received written notice. He had not responded. And he had no idea that the property owner he had been ignoring was the woman whose blazer he had put in the trash. I called Gerald back. I told him I did not want to act immediately. I told him I wanted to think about the right sequence. Gerald, who has known me for 19 years and understands that I am not a person who acts from impulse, said he would wait for my instructions. What I did next surprised even me a little. I called Vivian, not to tell her everything. Not yet. I called to ask her a question. I said, "Sweetheart, I want to ask you something honestly and I need you to answer honestly. Does Todd know what I own?" Vivian was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I don't think so, Mom. I don't think I've ever really told him the details." I said, "Has he ever asked?" Another pause. Then she said, "Not really." She said he had asked once, early in their relationship, how I had managed after Frank died, and she had said I had some properties and he had not asked further. I said, "Okay, thank you." Vivian said, "Mom, what are you thinking?" I said I was thinking about last night. I said the blazer thing had bothered me more than I had let on. Vivian said, "I know, I should have said something. I was embarrassed. I'm sorry." I said, "You do not need to apologize for his behavior." I said I was not calling to make her feel responsible. I was calling because I needed to understand the full picture before I decided anything. Vivian said, "Decided what?" I said, "Let me call you in a few days." What those few days looked like was this. I went to the building. I had not visited it in about 4 months because the management company handled day-to-day operations and I trusted them. I walked the ground floor. I looked at the exterior signage, which was indeed larger than the lease permitted. I sat in Harmon's for lunch on a Tuesday alone at a corner table. I ate the food, which was good. I watched the operation. I watched Todd move through the dining room, greeting tables, performing ease and confidence. He did not recognize me. I was not wearing the charcoal blazer. I was wearing a plain coat and the kind of unremarkable clothes that allow a person to be invisible in a room. Todd walked past my table twice. He did not look at me. I was 63 years old and not wary. anything expensive enough to register on his scale of who mattered. I paid my bill in cash. I left a generous tip. I walked out of that restaurant and stood on the sidewalk in front of the building for a moment. I looked at the signage. I looked at the building I had owned for 11 years. I thought about Frank, who had taught me that the most important thing in property was not the acquisition but the patience. I went home and I called Gerald and I told him what I wanted to do. The first thing was a formal letter addressing the lease violations, not a termination notice, a compliance notice. This is a standard property management communication that requires the tenant to address specific violations within a stated period or face further action. Gerald drafted it. It went out on official letterhead from my holding company, signed by Gerald as legal representative. The letter arrived at Todd's business address on a Thursday. Todd opened it on Friday morning. I know this because Vivian called me on Friday afternoon. She said Todd had received a letter from his landlord about lease violations and he was upset. She said he was on the phone with his business manager trying to understand how serious it was. She said he seemed rattled in a way she had not seen before. I asked her what she had told him. She said she had not told him anything. She said she did not know what to say. I said, "That is fine. You do not need to say anything yet." Vivian said, "Mom, is this you?" I said, "Vivian, the letter came from my holding company. It is a legitimate compliance notice regarding documented violations in Todd's lease. Everything in it is accurate and everything in it is standard property procedure." Silence. Then Vivian said quietly, "How long have you owned that building?" I said, 11 years. Another silence. She said, "Todd has been there for 4. I said, "Yes." She said, "And he never knew." I said, "It never came up." Vivian was quiet for a long moment. Then she said something I was not expecting. She said, "Mom, I need to tell you something." She said she had been wanting to say it for a while and had not known how. She said that Todd had become someone she did not fully recognize anymore, that the version of him she had married and the version she was living with had been drifting apart for about a year. She said the blazer had not been the first thing. She said it had been the most visible thing but not the first. I listened. I did not say I know or I noticed or I told you so. I just listened. She said she was not asking me to do anything or not do anything. She said she just wanted me to know where she was. I said, "Thank you for telling me." I said I loved her. I said whatever she decided, I was not going anywhere. That phone call changed what happened next, not the direction of it, the purpose of it. What I had started as a quiet correction of a man who had disrespected me became something larger. It became about making sure my daughter had accurate information about the full landscape of her own life. Here is what accurate information looked like. Todd's restaurant had a commercial lease that was 18 months from renewal. He had 2 outstanding violations. The subletting violation was the more serious one, both legally and financially. The catering operation he had been subletting to on weekend mornings was generating revenue that was not reflected in his own business filings, which created a secondary issue that his accountant would need to address. Todd did not know that I knew about the catering arrangement. Gerald had found it through a review of complaints filed with the building's management company, including a noise complaint from the adjacent tenant about early morning kitchen activity on days when Harmon's was not officially open. I had Gerald send a second letter. This one specifically addressed the subletting violation and requested documentation of all subletting arrangements within 30 days, or the property owner would exercise its right to pursue remediation under the lease terms. Todd received that letter on a Monday. By Wednesday, he had called the management company directly. I had asked the management company to route any calls from Harmon's to Gerald. Gerald took the call. Todd, according to Gerald, was professional at first. He asked about the nature of the violations and the timeline for resolution. Gerald explained, politely and precisely, what was required. Then Todd asked who the property owner was. He said he had been dealing with the management company for 4 years and had never had direct contact with the owner. Gerald said the owner preferred to manage through legal representation and that all communications should be directed to his office. Todd pushed. He said he would like to speak directly with the owner to discuss the situation. Gerald said he would pass that request along. Gerald called me after the call. He said Todd was worried. He said the tone had shifted from professional to something more searching, like a man trying to locate a wall he could not see. I told Gerald I would speak with Todd myself. I told him to pass along my personal number with no other context. Todd called me that evening at 7:14. I was sitting in my kitchen. I had made tea. I had my copy of the lease on the table in front of me, Gerald's report beside it, and my notebook with the dates of every small event from the past 2 years written in the back pages. I answered on the second ring. Todd said, "Hello, I'm trying to reach the owner of the property at," and he gave the building address. I said, "Yes, this is Stella." The silence that followed that sentence was one of the most specific silences I have ever heard. It had a texture, a weight. It was the silence of a man whose brain is doing very fast work while the rest of him stays very still. He said, "Stella, Vivian's mother." I said, "Yes." He said nothing for a long moment. Then he said, "I didn't know." I said, "I know you didn't." He said, "How long?" I said, 11 years. Another silence. Then, in a voice that had lost the smooth performance quality and was left with something more uncertain underneath, he said, "I see." I said, "Todd, I have 2 things to say and then I will let you go. The first is that the violations in your lease are real and need to be addressed regardless of anything personal between us. The subletting arrangement needs to stop, and the documentation needs to be provided to Gerald within the stated window. That is not personal. That is the lease." He said, "And the second thing." I said, "The second thing is personal." I said the blazer was a 12-year-old Italian wool blazer that belonged to my late husband and me and that I wore to his funeral. I said I did not raise my voice about it that night because I did not want to make a scene at my daughter's celebration. I said I wanted him to know that I noticed, and that I had been noticing for 2 years, and that the lease, the violations, the letters, none of that is connected to the blazer. I am not using one to punish the other, but I wanted you to know the full picture. Todd said, "Stella," I said, "you don't need to say anything tonight. The lease matters are on Gerald's timeline. Everything else is between you and Vivian, and that is entirely her business to handle, not mine." I said good night. I hung up. I sat at my kitchen table for a while after that. I drank my tea. I thought about Frank, who had always said that the most effective conversations were the ones where you said exactly what needed saying and nothing more. I thought I had come close. What happened over the following weeks was not dramatic in the way that public confrontations are dramatic. It was the quieter drama of truth settling into a space and rearranging the furniture. Todd addressed the lease violations. The subletting arrangement was terminated. The signage was corrected. Documentation was provided to Gerald within the required window. He was in compliance. He would remain a tenant. I had not threatened his tenancy. I had not told him I would not renew the lease. I had simply enforced what was already written in the agreement he had signed. The fact that this enforcement coincided with his understanding of who I was, that was not manipulation. That was just timing. Vivian told me, about 2 weeks after the phone call, that Todd had been different since. Quieter, more careful. She said he had apologized to her about the blazer. Not a performative apology, she said. A real one. The kind that comes from a person who has had something important shifted in their understanding of the world. She said he had asked her why she had never told him about the building. She said she had told him honestly that she had not thought it was relevant, and that she also had not known how much of it he already knew. He had said he should have asked more questions. He had said he had made assumptions. Vivian told me this and then said, "Mom, what do you think? Do you think people can actually change?" I thought about it carefully. Then I said, I think some people change when the cost of not changing becomes real to them. I said I did not know which kind Todd was. I said that was something only Vivian could assess from the inside. She said, "That's a very careful answer." I said, "I've had 63 years of practice." She laughed. It was her real laugh, the one she has had since she was small, that comes up fast and genuine before she can arrange her face around it. I told you at the beginning that this story ends in a good place. I want to tell you what that actually looks like. My relationship with Vivian is better now than it has been in 2 years. Not because Todd became a different person overnight. Because a truth that had been living under the surface of our family came up and got named. Because Vivian no longer felt the need to manage the space between her husband and her mother. Because I was no longer absorbing things in Sil. Ense and she was no longer pretending there was nothing to absorb. The lease renewed at the 12-month mark when Todd requested an early renewal meeting with Gerald. They met. The new terms were reasonable. I agreed to them. Harmons is still in the building. I want to be clear about this because I think it matters. I did not renew the lease to reward Todd. I renewed it because the building is a business asset and Harmons is a decent tenant when they follow the agreement. Business is business. I do not use my properties as emotional instruments. I use them as what they are. The personal education that came alongside the compliance process was a separate thing, and it resolved separately. Todd and I have spoken twice since the phone call. Once at a family dinner about a month later, where he was notably different in the way he occupied the room. Quieter, more genuinely attentive. He did not perform ease. He was just there, trying to be better in a way that was visible because it was effortful rather than automatic. The second time was at Vivian's birthday. He found a moment when we were both in the kitchen and he said simply, "I'm sorry about the blazer." I said I knew he was. He said he had not understood who he was dealing with. I said that was exactly right and that I hoped he understood now. He said yes. We left it there. That was enough. I want to tell you about the blazer. I still have it. Of course, I still have it. It is hanging in my closet between a coat I bought last winter and a dress I am saving for a good occasion. After the night Todd put it in the trash, after I had retrieved it and worn it through the rest of the evening, I had it cleaned. The dry cleaner pressed it back into its proper shape, and there is no evidence that it was ever anywhere it should not have been. I wore it to the lease renewal meeting with Gerald. This was not something Todd knew. He was not present for that meeting. But I knew. Frank would have found that funny. He had a very dry sense of humor and a deep appreciation for things that came full circle. I thought about Frank a lot during this whole period. About the building we had built together and the 30 years of careful, patient work that had made it possible. About the way he had always said that money was not a weapon but it was a tool, and the difference between the two was entirely about the hand that held it. I had held it carefully. I had not swung it. I had simply let Todd discover, at the moment when it mattered most, that the hand holding the pen on his lease was the same hand whose blazer he had put in the trash. That is not revenge. That is information. Delivered late, maybe, but delivered. I am 63 years old. I have a daughter who is finding her footing again in her own marriage. I have 2 grandchildren who call me on Sunday afternoons. I have a property portfolio that Frank and I built from 1 duplex and 30 years of showing up. I have a charcoal blazer that has been to Milan and back, and to a funeral and to a family dinner, and to the inside of a kitchen garbage can and out again, and it is still the best piece of clothing I own. What I do not have anymore is the habit of absorbing things in silence because making room feels easier than being seen. That habit cost me 2 years of dinners where I sat across from a man who had decided I was furniture. I am done paying that cost. The next time someone reaches for something that belongs to me, they will know what they are reaching for. That is not a threat. It is just the truth. And the truth, I have found, is the quietest and most permanent thing there is. If you stayed through this whole story, I want to ask you one thing. Not about Todd. About the 2 years before the blazer. About every small moment Stella absorbed and filed and said nothing about because she did not want to be the problem. Because I think most of us have a version of that. A table we have been sitting at too long. A person we have been giving too much charity to. A thing we have been pretending smells fine. And I want to know where your line is. Tell me in the comments. Tell me what it would have taken for you to act sooner, or whether you think Stella was right to wait. Because the real story here is not what happened when she finally spoke. It is everything that happened in the silence before she did. Share this with someone who needs to hear that patience is not the same as permission.